All right, welcome back to the slideshow. I'm Dakota Jackson. I'm a trombonist here in New Orleans, and I'm devoted to cultivating an appreciation and interest on the trombone. And I got my co-host Ben with me.
Hi guys, I'm Ben. I'm actually a fly fishing guide up here in Arkansas, but I play the bass trombone. I'm a huge enthusiast and I'm a buddy of Cody's, and I'm just really excited to be able to share information about the trombone.
All right, well, what's been going on with this week, Ben?
I'm going off of a busy week with spring gearing up. My job is really starting to become pretty crowded. I've been guiding quite a bit, and then I'm also doing some prep work, getting ready to go back up north to Alaska, which hopefully I'll actually be able to still record while I'm up there this time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm actually kind of looking forward to recording with you in Alaska. Just the New Orleans to Alaska distance is kind of fun that we're recording a podcast together. Like, technology is crazy. Um, but yeah, I've had a pretty good week. I just recently got a call about a big band gig. It'll be my first big band gig since the pandemic, and I'm gonna do some trombone choir stuff this week too with some people. So it's like, I don't know. I don't, knock on wood, but kind of coming around on some COVID stuff and like finally playing with other trombonists again. It's definitely been a minute, man. I look forward to that. Um, Normally about right now we would do a plug for a fake beer endorsement. We've done this like every episode, and I don't kind of feel like the joke is like, I don't know, kind of running its course. Like, I just don't know how funny it is anymore. But um instead I wanted to talk about like where me and Ben are thinking about doing possibly a Patreon, or a funny note, an OnlyFans. It will be about trombone. It will not be the typical OnlyFans content. But however
Hey,
you'd
this is
like
their
us to,
original mission now.
yeah,
The original mission is the content
that's
creator.
true. Yeah, that's true. Like, we'll probably we'll talk about what we're gonna do, but just, interested in seeing what you guys, if anyone would be into that, just creating some more content, obviously mostly trombone based, but I don't know, just kind of, if there's any interest in it, making doing that. And it would just help us to cover basically the fee, like the cost of keeping this going. It's not completely free for us with keeping the podcast up and editing softwares and everything like that, so it would help to offset a little bit. And maybe we'd improve Ben's mic situation. I know everyone uh everyone would be down to hear Mike's or Ben's voice on a very toasty level, instead of through the conditions we've been fighting through.
Well, also, that money could help us still pay for our subscription to our metrics. And how else would we know that we have 2 listens in Iran if it wasn't for the program that we use too?
Yeah, we do have 2 listens there. Me and Ben are
So we've got to
very,
pay those bills so we can find these things out.
that's that's right. That's right. I do enjoy digging through, and like I've said this in the past, we started, I really just wanted like 3 listeners. I actually told Ben, I'm not even making this up, I said one point, like, if we got 10 listens an episode, I would freak out. And we're already like 200. Like, that, it's honestly insane, and it means so much that you guys just listen to us. It really does. I'm glad that the trombone community is, interested in learning more about trombone and starting a conversation. We're always open to hear from you guys, and I mean, even if you disagree with us, like, I just like hearing everyone's thoughts. Also, on the note of recording, I did change chairs for this week. So if you bear through the last 2 episodes and listen to my chair creak about a million times, I do apologize. It is fixed now. So that's a huge, huge positive. Um, I do want to talk quickly about the trombone in the news this week. Trombone Shorty has a new single out called Come Back. I've recently kind of been getting back into Shorty a little bit. Like, I don't know. I just enjoy listening to his music, and he's not, and I feel like he's not lying about what he is. I talked about this before. So he's not pretending to be something he's not, and his music sounds great, and he's a very talented musician. Um, on a more somber note, Conrad Janis died at the age of 94. He was apparently like a trad trombonist, and he was the father of Mindy on Mork and Mindy, the show with Robin Williams. Now, I didn't really watch it myself, a little bit before my time, but I did know of it mainly because of Robin Williams. And I'm actually kind of surprised we didn't talk about this guy when we did trombone and pop culture because I mean, he has recordings you can go check out on YouTube, and Mark and Mindy was a really big show when it was on.
I guess because before both of our times that it definitely passed me up. I'd never heard of it actually. Might age me a little bit.
Yeah, me and Ben are about the same age. I'm 26, and I think you're what, 27, Ben? 28?
28, yeah.
28. Yeah, I'll be 27 pretty soon. That's crazy to think about. Man, getting closer to 30. Don't love that. Um, um, so the topic for this week is George Roberts, and man, man, I got so pumped about this episode. First of all, I actually just love doing these player episodes. They're kind of my favorite. And I was already kind of a fan of George, but like just digging into the research really even heightened it for me. And I just like learning about him and like the kind of person he was made me an even bigger fan. And I really tried to dig deep for this one for you guys because I just wanted to do George justice, but also in digging deep and stuff, I hope I can find you guys some nuggets. The good thing about George, and I can't say this about every trombonist out there, is there's a ton of information on him. So if you want to do more research after this, it's out there. There's interviews with him and stuff, which is awesome. Um, but hopefully we found some cool nuggets you didn't know, and like we'll kind of be focusing around that. I did want to kind of briefly talk about his impact on me. I'll let Ben go next because I assume his impact is larger since he's a bass trombonist. But uh as far on my end, it's George is like to me, I was thinking about this, like he's he's Mr. Bass Trombone. And like I guess quickly, if you don't know who George Roberts is he was, we'll obviously dig deep into his life and everything, but this guy is kind of the face of bass trombone. And to me, I was thinking he's kind of like the Jaco Pastorius of the bass trombone. And maybe that's a weird comparison, but like Jaco took the bass, which was an instrument used like in the background to keep time and everything, and not really like a solo instrument, and turned it into like the forefront. And I feel like that's one of the huge things that George did for bass trombone was, and we'll get into this, he was just so devoted to playing melodies on the bass trombone and being beautiful on the bass trombone. And he was able to, I think, really influence so many people. Not just, I mean, bass trombonists, but also like bass trombone builders and stuff. I mean, I think he completely revolutionized bass trombone's role like in the world. And like personally, I've always kind of viewed him as like this huge, overwhelming figure in bass trombone. But like as I've gotten more into it, it's been a bigger thing. And like I've told Ben about this before, like I kind of fake bass trombone gigs around New Orleans because there's not a lot of bass trombones getting called. I'll get calls and I'll cover the bass trombone, but can I do it on my tenor trombone? But a lot of times when I cover those books, I'm covering George parts, and so he's been really an example for me for like what the bass trombone should sound like, and I think he did that for a lot of people. But yeah, Ben, what was George Roberts' impact on you?
Well, George was the first bass trombonist that I was told to listen to when I first tried learning bass trombone. Went to a pretty small college, and pretty much what the situation is anywhere you go when you ask people at a small college, like let's say you ask your professors or whoever, hey, who should I listen to if I want to listen to a good example of bass trombone? Bass trombone. Well, the first answer comes up anytime. It's going to be George Roberts, especially if they're not a trombone teacher, because that's going to be the only one they know. And so George Roberts kept coming up. So I started researching him, listening to more of his music. And he was really the first solo bass trombonist that I could find that I would listen to quite a bit. Now, I really found out later that he didn't have a lot of material that he was the lead of. And so you kind of had to do some digging to find some more recordings of him, even though he recorded 6,000 times. You still had to dig on the personnel list to find him sometimes. But it was just really cool to, I don't know, just every time you would find a bass trombone player, a new bass trombone player, they would probably have some type of tribute to George Roberts. Like off the top of my head, one of the big bass trombone players I like listening to is Ben Van Dyke. I know he has had a tribute to George Roberts, at least on one of his albums. Another bass trombonist I follow, Massimo Perrone, he has definitely put together one. Bill Reichenbach. So anybody who makes it really big in bass trombone at some point, they're probably going to be mentioning George Roberts at some point. And that shows you just how huge he is in the community. And then bass trombone community might be a small community, but the fact that he was able to hold that position, I guess, just be the guy to go to for so long, I guess, is what makes it so impactful. And when we started researching for this episode, I really started realizing that he's a lot bigger than just bass trombone. You're not just finding information about him on the trombone specific websites. You're finding out things about him from articles dealing with Frank Sinatra, talking about situations with him. You're hearing about him from even articles written by Vanity Fair. Like, this guy was bigger than just bass trombone, which I thought was interesting, since not growing up in the era that he was really the most popular. I guess it's just not something that you see today. You don't see trombone celebrities very often anymore, I'd say. And so it's pretty cool to see that apparently he was one of those at some point.
Yeah, man. We'll dig into this. But yeah, 6,000 recordings. And I I don't want to like give away anything before we get into it. But if you're just listening to this and you don't know who George Roberts is, I can guarantee you've listened to him already. And I know that sounds crazy. You're thinking, what? But he was like the studio guy. And if you've ever watched, Jaws or Star Wars, some of these huge ones, he was on those recordings. So yeah, like his impact in terms of, and like we'll get into this, I think like his impact in terms of even orchestration and stuff was pretty important. Like, I think he opened up, like, people wrote more for bass trombone after him. I mean, that's the kind of impact he had. And yeah, like I think like almost all bass trombonists today kind of owe some part of that to him, like he like opened doors for them, and I know you're talking about tributes. I don't know if like he knew Ben Van Dyke. He might have. I mean, Ben's German. I believe that's correct, right? He's not Austrian, right? He's German.
He's Dutch.
Okay, he's Dutch. Sorry. So there's a good chance that they didn't know each other, since George lived in LA and stuff. But like Massimo Perrone, he like played with him in Nua, and I think like his impact on the musical community was super large, and we'll get into that. We're gonna break it up. Is the first half of the episode. We're gonna go through his life, and then for the the guys out there who want to I know this is a big following of ours, we'll get into his gear and stuff, which I actually was pretty interesting, more interesting than I even thought it was going to be, because he had strong opinions, and there's a lot of information on different stuff he played on, as opposed to some other people where I know when we did Curtis, it was like there was a little bit of transition, but it was a lot of kind of like, oh, he played what he had, like he just played the 3B full through. But they're like, George clearly has some opinions on his gear, so that'll be kind of fun. And we'll talk about recordings he's on, not all 6,000 of them, because we don't want to sit here all night and do that, but we'll talk about maybe some deep cuts you haven't heard of, and some stuff that was important in terms of his development and whatnot. But starting off, yeah, he was born in Des Moines. I looked up how to say this. I'm sorry if you're from Iowa and I'm not saying that right. I do apologize. I kind of thought it was just like a silent in, Des Moines, and apparently it's like a French word, and I can't remember how they say it, but Des Moines, Iowa. And he first like went to the first time he was exposed to bass trombone. He went to his older brother's concert in junior high, and his older brother was playing bari sax. And after the concert, he told his mom like, "Oh, I want to play the one that goes up and down in your hands," and so she was like, "Okay." And then whenever they went to apparently they went to the teacher after that to talk about playing bass trombone, and she just told him right away like, "Your arms are not long enough," which a couple of things like right off the bat, like I think I was talking a bit about this. It's like whenever I play a performance, I always try to think, especially when I was playing like Mardi Gras and stuff not that long ago. It's there's a lot of times you can be like, okay, I'm tired of this gig, or like, oh, it doesn't really matter how well I play. But I always try to keep in the back of my mind, like this may be the first time someone hears trombone or their first exposure to it. So it's important to like be in the moment and enjoy it and like try and give it your all because you never know the influence it's going to have. I mean, some potentially some random junior high trombonist was the one who inspired George Roberts to play trombone, which is pretty crazy. I know, like with Curtis Fuller, we kind of went through that story and it was unfortunately like kind of a forced situation, but like his big influence was like JJ Johnson, and like that's that's an obvious one, but we don't really necessarily have that story here. I mean, I'll get to it in a minute. There was someone kind of like that, but it's certainly when he started playing, it was not because he heard like the best trombonist on the planet or something. He just was amazed with the trombone. And I think, the trombone's a beautiful instrument. Like inspiration can come from anyone playing it. And like, I think that's something we should all keep in mind. Also, in terms of him being short, I don't want to call out who this was, but I did talk to a trombonist that I looked up to. I got a lesson with, and he was super tall. And I was like, man, you're really tall. And he said, yeah, you got to be at least 6 foot to play trombone. And I could not wait to come back and tell Ben that because Ben is not 6 foot.
Not quite.
And I kind of think like the bass trombone is in a lot of ways like the shorter guy, shorter trombonists, like that's kind of their instrument. I say that there is some killing super short tenor trombone players. I'm not saying you can't play really short, you obviously can, but the triggers can help you save a little bit of arm room. And it's not like George started on the bass trombone. We'll transition to that, but I think it's interesting that he was told he was too short and then later became like Mr. Bass Trombone. But I have this really great quote from him about that when he started, and he says, "The teacher put me on clarinet. I quickly replied that I did not want to play the clarinet. I wanted to play the trombone. I could smell the slide oil already. Anyways, I ended up playing the clarinet in the school band for 2 years. It was really kind of funny the way I ended up playing on clarinet, but I hated it." He said, um, I just hate to read this whole thing, but I just have to, guys. It's okay. He said, I wanted to play trombone. So finally, one day I went to downtown to Des Moines to the basement of this musical store. And it was up on a top shelf was this old, dusty, beat up trombone, just really beat up. Now, I have to explain that we really didn't have a heck of a lot of money when we were kids. This would have been 1939, 1940, in case you guys are wondering. I started playing trombone when I was 12. Anyway, I saw the horn and went to talk to the shop owner and how much it would be if like to sell the trombone for. And he said he could probably have it for $5. And he said, now my brother and I, when we wanted new bikes, would go down to the Western Auto Store and get used bikes out of the back, take them home and paint them. These were our new bikes because we couldn't afford real new bikes. So I told my dad that I had found this trombone down in the basement of Des Moines Music. I told dad it was the greatest looking horn I'd ever seen. I also told dad that if he bought the trombone for me, I would paint it, stressing that it was only $5 and that I would have a brand new trombone and could then start playing trombone in the school band. Dad told me that he wouldn't go look at it. He would go look at it the next day. So all day long, I kept thinking, boy, I can't wait to get home. Anyways, I came home through the back door, not the front door. Didn't go through the living room, but went straight to dad and asked if he had seen the trombone. Dad said, George, I saw the trombone and I wouldn't give a nickel for it. I said to dad, you don't love me. I want to play the trombone. I've got to have a trombone. I told dad that since he didn't love me, I was running away from home. Dad said, okay, fine. I'll help you pack your bags. Anyways, I got mad and stormed my bedroom and noticed that it was starting to get dark outside. I packed a small bag of socks and shoes and stomped out of the back door of the house. There was an alley beside the house. I got about halfway up the alley and it was getting dark and spooky. So I thought that maybe I would put off running away idea until the next morning. So I went back inside and informed my father that I was still running away, but wasn't putting it off until morning. I was such a fool, but learned a lesson that I'll never forget as long as I live. My father said, "Get in the living room and sit down. I want to talk to you." So I stomped in the living room and lying on the couch. And lying on the couch in an open case was a brand new trombone. It was a super olds, and I looked at the horn and had just made the biggest fool of myself ever. I started crying. It still gives me a funny feeling thinking about it because there was a true love affair. My dad going down there and getting my trombone. Now, dad paid every month for that trombone he couldn't afford, but he did it out of his love for me. And I just, that's just an amazing story, man. I mean, first of all, the quote, "I could already smell the slide oil," is just like, that is, it's hilarious, man.
Yeah, I guess I didn't realize that he threatened to run away from home if he didn't get a trombone.
Yeah, man, he was gonna play the trombone. It's kind of funny because we've talked about some people just kind of ended up on the trombone. I mean, certainly I did. I don't think I didn't have like a moment where it's like, if I don't play the trombone, it's the end of the world. I just kind of ended up on the trombone. But there's, I can get into my personal story, but like it certainly wasn't running away from home if dad didn't buy me one. Um, but I love that, man. $5 for some beat up horn. He was gonna paint it to make it look new. Like he was ready to play no matter what. And I don't know, it's just like it was meant to be. So like after that, after he goes through the after he gets his horn and everything he's playing, he went to Drake University, which is in Des Moines. Um and he was going to study with some trombone students, and he studied with this guy Jack Dalby, who played euphonium. And I couldn't find he said something about how this guy was like competing with Robert Marsteller on euphonium, and I couldn't really find a ton of stuff speaking towards that. I did look into Jack Dalby a little bit. He uh he actually ended up being a teacher for most of his like musical days. He was a master's student at Drake when he was there. He had gotten his undergrad at Kansas, and then he went to teach at Pleasant Hill, Missouri, and before moving back to Des Moines, where he ended up teaching, and was drafted in World War II and stationed in New Mexico, and did that for about 2 years before coming back to Des Moines. And he ended up teaching in Portland and kind of a number of locations. And I guess he did like magic shows like up through Missouri and stuff. And I was telling Ben about this. It's kind of crazy. Like I don't really know anything about this guy, but he's like in a way been kind of immortalized by being George Roberts' first trombone teacher, which is kind of crazy to think about.
Yeah, it's something how that ends up working out because these people that you mentioned, like this person could easily just not be talked about nowadays, but here we are bringing him up just because we found a connection between him and George Roberts.
Yeah, man. And like it speaks to what I was just saying about playing. Like, when it comes to teaching students and stuff, like you never know. So you just gotta like give it your. I think like everything you do with the trombone, you should just like put all of yourself into it because you just never know what it's going to mean to somebody. I think about that a lot, especially in terms of giving kids lessons and stuff, like just trying to be as prepared as I can be because I don't want to set someone off on the wrong path or something. And, like maybe one of those people turns out to be George Roberts or something, which is crazy. So when he was 13, he went to go see the U.S. Marine Band and saw his dad told him he was going to see his first real trombonist. And there's this guy, Robert Isle, and he was blown away by his ability to play and desperately wanted to meet him, which I didn't know who this guy was before this. I don't know, maybe Ben's familiar with him. Robert Isle, it's Isele. I assume that's how he pronounces it, Isle. Um,
I'm,
yeah, there's some recordings of him on YouTube though. The dude absolutely rips. He's a classical trombonist, but his soloing ability is insane. I mean, the Marine Band's always has great trombonists, but this guy was kind of a featured soloist with them. Um, and yeah, like I'd never heard of him, but like if you haven't, please go check him out on YouTube because it's worth a listen. He is incredible, both in terms of technical ability, like Joseph Alessi kind of level moving around the horn, but also he like really sings. And I kind of, not to get too deep into this on a gear note, but I kind of think that he was like just mainly playing a pea shooter, and kind of makes me think sometimes about dudes like Arbin and stuff like that, like kind of how we've transitioned to like all the classical music should be on these big horns. But I think I'd be kind of interested in seeing more dudes play just on pea shooters, especially for period pieces or whatever, because they weren't really going into bigger horns. But yeah, you should definitely go check him out. Guy sounds fantastic. um
Yeah.
so he actually got to meet Robert Isle because he was doing later in life, after he had gotten a lot more acclaim, he was doing a clinic with the Marine trombone section where he was like a soloist and everything. And he mentioned to some of the guys in this Marine trombone section that he wanted to meet him. And one of the guys in the trombone section was like, well, yeah, I've got his number. So he called him up, and he called him on the gig, and he put George on the phone, and George's like, "Oh, who's this?" And he said, "Oh, it's Robert Isle." And apparently George just started spilling into like, "Oh, this is who I am. Like, I'm this bass trombonist, and like I've done some work with this and that." And one of the guys in the section was like, "Hey man, like he knows who you are. Like he's a big fan." And apparently George was like so stoked. He said like he really wanted to go meet him, and so after the clinic they like just drove to this guy's house, and George had like had a long meeting with him, and they just hung out, and he told him that he had thought about him for like the last 60 years or whatever, like this, he had just thought about this guy every single day. And um George, he talks about this several times, but he said he was always such a great fan of his playing, because he said his playing was amazing and it was a reflection of his personality. Like George kept bringing that up, that like he was a big fan of like, if you're happy and you smile while you play and everything, it'll be reflected in your music. Like he was very big on being a good person, and like your playing represents you as a person.
Yeah, the few stories I've heard, had a tuba teacher of mine who talked about actually driving George Roberts to an airport. But it's like the stories that I've heard of him meeting George Roberts along with other people meeting George Roberts have all been the same. They said that he was almost overly nice. They said that he was just exuded kindness. That was just the way. I guess that was the way that Dr. Brewer put it. My old teacher. He was just saying that he was just one of the nicest people he had ever met, which sounds silly, but whenever you read these interviews with George Roberts, like that is important to him because, well, he does say your personality is going to show through your playing. So whether you believe that or not, he definitely did. And so in his mind, him like it affects everything.
Yeah, man. He does talk about it several times, and not just in terms of it being reflected in playing, but like in terms of getting work and being a working musician. George was very much on the like being professional, and then like smiling and like being like a positive person. And also to that point, like yeah, I also knew Dr. Brewer. Me and Ben both went to a school where he was teaching. He was like a tuba teacher, so I didn't really study with him one on one, but Dr. Brewer was a super like great person. And like I I always was a big fan. And I think like, man, if Dr. Brewer was saying he was like an incredibly over the top positive person, like I mean that holds some weight for me for sure. um I did want to say real fast before we moved on with George, just some stuff about Robert Isle. He was when he was in high school, he was like a national award winner for soloing. And then he went to Eastman, where he studied with Emery Remington, who maybe in the future we should do an episode about. I what man, as we kept going through this, I kept thinking about like other episodes to do, because like first of all, I wanted to do a bass trombonist after doing a tenor trombonist, and George, there was no debate on who it was going to be. It was going to be George. And there's a bunch of other guys I'd love to get into, but this is the bass trombonist. And but like eventually love to get into some deep cuts, and Emory Remington would be a great one. Like he had a huge impact on trombone. But Robert Isle joined the Marine Band and became the first trombonist, and then eventually became a featured soloist with them before moving to do some freelance work in DC. And he eventually became a member of the National Symphony Orchestra as the second trombonist. But yeah, if you guys don't if you guys, I really urge you so much to go check this guy out. I'm so glad that I found him in the process of going through George. um Dude absolutely rips. um Kind of going back to George's transitions. So after he had like gone and studied and everything, he ended up getting drafted in the Navy, and he was shipped to Guam for 2 years. And he, after being in the Navy, he came back and was going to go to like a kind of like a musical conservatory situation. And he was studying composition, and he was going in LA. And then a friend of his who was a bass player asked if he'd like to go on the road, and he was just like so pumped about the potential of playing. And apparently like the gigs were just kind of like cheap hotel gigs is what he said, but he couldn't believe he was being able to make money with his horn. And I guess he said his parents weren't super thrilled about him leaving school to go just make money, but he was all about it. And it kind of worked out because he ended up getting picked up with the Ray Robbins big band. I don't know a ton about them. But while he was with them, he got a call to go to Gene Krupa's big band in Chicago. And he was with them from 1947 to 48. But this was a really impactful moment on his life because the lead trombonist in this group was Irby Green. And at this time, George was only 18 years old, and Irby was only 22. But even with that age gap, especially with younger people, it's like he viewed him as like an older guy looked up to, and I guess they remained friends after that. But he like was like from what he talked about Irby, he was blown away by his playing, which makes sense because he's Irby Green. But he was in that band with Irby and another guy, Gene Mullins, who I didn't really know a ton about. I did a little bit of diving. I did find out that he's on this like album Modern Country with Kai Wending. And not to just like keep leaving George and getting off in these little rabbit holes, but this is like honestly one of my favorite parts of doing the pod is just finding things that I would never have checked out otherwise. But Kai Wending has this album, Modern Country, and the album cover is super cool. You should definitely check it out. It's like Kai Wending standing in front of this like Mustang. I'm not sure if it's a Shelby GT or if it's just a normal one. It's got but it's red with the little fins, and he uh he's standing in front of this super cool car, and the album is like kind of country music. It's kind of crazy to listen to. Like it's not super typical country, obviously, because there's like a trombone quartet playing in front of it, but it's kind of like country rhythms with trombone. Definitely like a weird look into if you get a chance. But so while he's with Gene Krupa, this is when he like George ends up making the transition to bass trombone. And one of the things that prompted him to do this was he was blown away by Irby's playing, and he thought, I want to be on that level. Like if I want to make a career in this, I want to be at the Irby Green level. And he thought, but he just felt like he couldn't compete with Irby Green, which I can relate to that. I mean, not that I've played with Irby Green, but I can understand feeling like it's going to be hard to get to that level. Um, but he thought like he had better pedal tones than Irby, so he thought about making the switch to bass trombone. And I guess he asked Krupa if he could do it, and he was like, "Yeah, sure, go ahead. It's cool with me." So we made the switch to bass trombone, and he wanted to play bass trombone like Bart Versalona, who we've talked about on this pod quite a bit, surprisingly. But he noted that Bart was kind of like a powerful and like a forceful bass trombonist, which is nothing wrong with that if that's the direction you want to go. Definitely a lot of good guys like that. But he wanted to be like kind of different. He wanted to play it like super beautiful ballads. And we'll get into this later, but he was a huge fan of like using the bass trombone as like a melody horn. And so he wanted to be like Irby Green down the octave. And so eventually Krupa said, like, you want to take a solo with us? Like, you don't take a lot of solos. And he played a solo on the bass trombone for Krupa, where he started. It was a Where or When, and he started on a low E flat, and then he wasn't quite sure at this period, but like he did that and like the reception was pretty good. Like people were really into it and he was really about that. And then he said that he went up to the trombone section after that and Irby Green said like, wow, you're like the only like one of the only people I know who plays that thing like a trombone. And he said that that comment like was what solidified for him like this is what I need to do. And he actually referenced this like several times in a couple different interviews I saw. Like that moment to him was like the moment that he became a bass trombonist and like realized that this is what he needed to do. And i I don't know, I think that's kind of incredible. Like first of all, the comment from Irby, you played that like a trombone, I find that interesting. I mean, George brought it up a couple times, mentioning that it wasn't. He's like a lot of people, and we'll kind of get into this with Gear. He had some thoughts on it, kind of similar to that, but he did feel like it was a trombone and wanted it to be super lyrical and not like a member of another family. And on that same note, he was like really about playing trombone or bass trombone in like the middle register and using low notes tastefully and not pigeonholing yourself or getting in trouble super low. So I just kind of find that philosophy interesting and just kind of this thought of like this moment with Irby Green, like Irby Green's approval is what like kind of solidified playing bass trombone for him.
Oh, sorry, I was just saying I had heard that story before. I just didn't realize that he honestly considered that the big moment. I had heard, I guess, him tell about Irby one time saying that. So that's really cool that you were able to find that, and that makes sense. You hear to this day a lot of people kind of flocking back to that idea now. A lot of people think that bass trombones have kind of gotten a little too far away from, I guess, our tenor trombone counterparts, and you'll hear them say like, people just don't play it like a trombone anymore. And so it's really neat to hear that George was definitely in the camp of wanting it to be like a trombone.
Yeah, man. Um, so like right after that, Krupa's band ended up breaking up, and he moved to Reno, where he met his wife Sue. And while he was in while he was in Reno, that's when he got the call from Stan Kenton, and Stan Kenton asked him if he'd like to join his band, and apparently he like shouted into the phone, "Yes," um, which is pretty cool. I didn't dig as much in this as I'd want to, but he was super into the Kenton big band because he always wanted to play in that big band, and it was just like so powerful. And he said it could just knock you out. You don't forget that. It's a sound you want to be around all your life. My dream bands were Woody Herman and Kenton, so I was fortunate to get to play with Krupa and Kenton. So and yeah, and while he was in that band, he definitely like one, he shaped the sound of the big band for sure, which is like there's tons of his albums you can go check out. Also, if you go check out those albums, there's some pretty killing trombonists with him, like Frank Rosalino and him were in that band together. If you don't know who Frank is, probably end up doing an episode on him, but
Oh,
check him out. What?
that will be an episode.
For sure. Um, and I know Carl Fontana was in Kenton's big band. I'm not 100% sure they were in the band together, but I'm pretty sure they were. Um, I did find it was interesting. I found out that during his period of moving to Kenton, apparently he was getting prepared and he just memorized a bunch of his bass trombone parts, and he would go outside and play and try and like fill up the space to try and build up lung capacity because he was very worried about being able to get to the level that Stan Kenton was at, which I think is just an interesting concept in general, going outside to try and like build up your sound. And it kind of makes sense. And I've had a lot of thoughts. This is just kind of a personal rant here, but I've had a lot of thoughts about how like spaces can affect how people sound. I actually had a professor bring this idea to me. This wasn't completely organic, but just thinking about like why Joe Alessi sounds like Joe Alessi and why Conrad Herwig sounds like Conrad Herwig and why like Bill Watrous sounds like Bill Watrous, it could have an effect on where they were typically playing, a little New York club, a big concert hall, a recording studio, like it's not a factor. I'll just say that. And I think it's interesting that he like went outside because like I know personally I kind of hate playing outside. It's like it just kind of kills the sound off, and he was just trying to go outside and like really sing through the horn. And while he was with Kenton, he ended up being a featured soloist. I think some of these you can go find online. I know Stella by Starlight was a big one that he played. And he noted, I really love this line. He said he would just try and play beautiful notes and long tones as opposed to like people playing a ton of stuff and super high. He specifically referenced Maynard Ferguson. I find that hilarious. With a ton of mutes and stuff. And he was like, he noted that like the audience would just love his beautiful ballads. And he said some of the other guys who get irked in the band, like they do all this work and here he is just playing these ballads and like getting his great reception. And he always, I guess he said just like this period, he always kept Irby's advice of playing the bass trombone like a trombone and just playing like beautiful melodies um into the audience. And on that note, I will get into this later a little more, but he always, like, he noted that his number one most important thing on the trombone was sound. And it's funny, I think I don't want to I'm not gonna out anybody and say what was said, but there was me and Ben when we were with one of our professors going to ITF a couple years back. He actually asked us this question. He said, like, "What's the number one most important thing?" And I guess to brag on myself, my immediate answer was sound. He did not actually agree with me, and I've had conversations with people about this who said other things, and I can see a lot of debate. But George was definitely in the sound camp. Like, just having a beautiful sound was the number one most important thing.
So I do find it funny that the same professor did not answer sound and said wrong. Had a mantra of sound, accuracy, speed. I think he even believed that to some point, but yeah.
So he, after playing with Kenton's band for a while, he went out to LA, and this is kind of ultimately where he would end up, is in the LA recording scene. This is how he ended up on so many recordings. And I could sit here and go on about tons and tons of recording, but I'm going to instead kind of like focus in on a couple of things. And one of them was like when he first moved out there, he said that one of the big contracts was Bobby Helfer, and he didn't want to give him a gig because he said he was a jazzer and didn't think he could play legit or semi legit stuff for movies and whatnot. So he was he's unemployed, and he said a huge turning point was he got a call from Bobby Helfer, and he asked him what he was doing, and he said, and I really love this quote. He said he was drinking an unemployed cup of coffee. I'm definitely gonna try and use that at some point. I mean, hopefully I won't be unemployed, but if I am, that's what I'm gonna tell people. Um, but Helfer asked him how long it would take him to get to the studio with his horns and stuff, and he said, "Oh, probably about 40 minutes." And he just said, "Okay, be here." He said, "Be here in 40 minutes," and hung up. And George said he like hauled over to the studio, and he got there in like 30 minutes. And he walks in, and it's like the LA Philharmonic, and Igor Stravinsky is standing there. And apparently the bass trombonist had walked out, so he walks over to the bass trombone spot, and he said, "I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to count super hard." And he noticed he had a solo with the harp. And while they were playing, Igor cut them off, and he said, told the harp player, "You're wrong, follow him." And he was able to, they went back to playing. And after the gig, everyone was congratulating him. They're like, "Oh, you're doing a great job." And apparently Helfer was really upset, probably because the bass trombonist walked out on him. But he like got in the car after that, and he said he started shaking because he like realized like how big the situation was. Like he had just played music for Igor Stravinsky with this Bobby Hilfer guy also giving him work and like all this stuff. And he's like, he said that if he would have thought about all that, like if he had more time and thought about all that beforehand, he probably wouldn't have done so well. So it's like just like the adrenaline of the moments what got him through. And he also noted that the bass trombonist who walked out like never got a call again after that. And he said, no matter what, no matter how good you are, you never walk out because there's always a guy waiting around the corner. And I just kind of thought that was interesting. Obviously, in this case, it was George Roberts. It's a real bummer for the other guy because that's a quick way to get shut down. Another thing I want to talk about was while he was in LA, he was driving by Capitol Records one day, and he uh he knew a guy from Capitol Records, Lee Gillette, who had recorded him when he was with the Kenton Big Band and stuff on the road. And he thought that this guy was just like a little recording engineer. And he thought, man, I'd love to go see this guy. So he like stops at Capitol Records and he walks in and he's like, oh, can I see Lee? And they're like, who? And he's like, oh, Lee Gillette. I'm like, oh, okay, we'll put you up to Mr. Gillette's office. And it was kind of taken back because he thought that he thought this guy was just going to be like in some like studio room working with a bunch of like microphones. And so they call him up to this guy's office and he's like at this huge office and he's sitting in there and he said he was just going to walk past because he was so nervous because he didn't realize what was going on. And the guy had recognized him because I guess when he was on the road with Stan Kitten he was like a fan of the bass trombone and like George's work. So he calls him into his office and he's talking to him and he realizes that this guy's like a big exec at Capitol Records. And while he's in there, he says, oh, like I'd like you to meet this guy. And that guy was Nelson Riddle. And which I think is amazing. Now, if you don't know who Nelson Riddle is, he was like a musical director for Stan Kenton for a long time. Or no, sorry, not, oh my god, he was a musical director for Frank Sinatra for a long time. And he also like was just a big guy for arranging and composing in LA. And him and George ended up having a great friendship. I think actually uh in Nelson Riddle's book, he actually mentioned or he mentioned George Roberts, and that was a big point like of catapulting George's career. He also ended up playing with Frank Sinatra a lot after that, and George was huge on Frank Sinatra. He actually said, I can't, this quote like is honestly somewhat crazy to me. He said that Frank Sinatra was the greatest trombone teacher in the world. And that's like it just speaks volumes about how important George saw singing through the horn, you know, like this male vocalist, like he said his phrasing and his like timing and everything was just like a masterclass on how to play the trombone. And it really just speaks to like, you know, George's mindset when it came to playing. Oh, Nelson Riddle, they were friends, and whenever Nelson Riddle did this album, The Joy of Living, and before that, George had said to Nelson Riddle that he thought that the bass trombone was the greatest melody horn on the planet. And Nelson Riddle had laughed at him and said, "You must have the heart of an elephant." And later, when he did this album, Joy of Living, which, not to give too much away, will be our album rec for the week, but when he did this album, The Joy of Living, George said, like, he got a bunch of solos on the album. He was playing a bunch of there's a couple tracks on there where it's just George playing the melodies, and he said like he couldn't wait after that to like get on the podium whenever he was talking about the album and say, Nelson Riddle, you must have the heart of an elephant. And I don't even know what that means, man. You must have the heart of an elephant. I guess that just means like elephants are big, so like the low register stuff, like I don't know what
Well,
that means.
so I have an account from Nelson Riddle's side of things. This is from the National Jazz Archive. Nelson Riddle talking about his relationship with George Roberts. And anyways, so let me scroll up here. He wrote a lot about this, and in fact, it's a pretty large article I'm reading. But here he is talking about the bass trombone. He says, "I feel that I've made one contribution to the instrument in recent years. My use of the bass trombone arrangements has made it much more popular and caused other writers to employ it," which I think most people would agree with that. With Nelson Riddle being so, he was so huge at the time. His influence, he would definitely influence other band leaders, other big band. Like he would influence quite a few people, and that influence came because George Roberts was his neighbor in Santa Monica, California. He says he and his wife were living in an apartment right down the street. And George would come over to the house and we'd talk. He said, slowly I started writing things in for him, and naturally he played them beautifully. He's probably the best bass trombone player in the world, but he's got me a little disturbed. because he makes long excursions out of town doing clinics throughout the country for the good of the American youth. And then he goes on to talk about how George Roberts, even though he's kind of on top of the world at this time, the best of his craft, it's got Nelson Riddle a little messed up because George ended up being hard to pin down because he was spending his time going and doing clinics for schools and kids, which, to be perfectly honest, that's really cool to think about. To know that he was still humble enough to not get all wrapped up in everything and still just go teach kids. I don't know. I thought it was cool to see this from Nelson Riddle's point of view on how that went down, uh,
Yeah,
because
for sure.
there is quite a bit of information about Nelson Riddle, and like I said in this, there's actually quite a bit of Nelson Riddle wrote in the National Jazz Archive, and I do suggest people look this up because it doesn't just have to do with George Roberts. He has a lot in general about dealing with Frank Sinatra and quite a few other musicians in here. I'm sorry to hijack that, but
No, no, man. I love I love little interjections that lead to cool deep dives and stuff. Um, so George ended up staying in LA for a long time and doing a ton of recordings, and I honestly we could keep going on and on. But like I mean his life is well documented and like a lot of massive stuff, and he ended up passing away from pneumonia in 2014. I think he was 86. Sounds right. Yeah, he was 86. And I actually remember, like, I'm trying to think back, like I kind of remember when he passed away. I remember talking about it with people, man. I think, man, were we in school together in 2014, Ben? Does that sound right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Because I do remember talking to you about it, like, vaguely. I mean, that's a
He
long time
wasn't
ago.
playing. He wasn't playing by that point, or if he was, it was very little. He had MS, and so he had really not been on the scene very much at that point, and so he wasn't a very public figure back in 2014. Because, like I said, he had multiple sclerosis, and so that apparently was doing a number as well.
Yeah. He definitely lived a full life. I mean, one thing I'll say, man, is like obviously the guy was such a force of positivity. Like it honestly inspired me reading into him about it. But he got a lot of great musical fulfilling moments, and he had a great life outside of that too. It wasn't just like one of these things where he was musically fulfilled but like may have suffered in other areas. He was married, and I think he had a really happy life, and that warms my heart, and it's like a little bit of reflection on you get in what you put out kind of thing. But I just want to tell another quick couple stories. I know like we've been going on, but it's just there's so many good things out there. um One of the things, when he got older, he talked about he was still trying to play a little bit, and he would just try and mainly focus on ballads because that was kind of what he'd already done, and he could kind of fake the things that were starting to degrade. And he was a big fan of like yourself better than like anyone else does. So going in and you know being a good judge of yourself in terms of growth and development. um and he was always a big preacher of simplicity. He said that when youngsters see a pedal tone right on the page, they just hit it like bam. One of the most important things that I could say to kids is absolutely master of simplicity and sound, time, and inception. All the simple things. Do the simple things really just fabulous. You'll have 95% of the business. If you do, there's only 5% of the business that's like stark terror. You never know when that's coming, but if you're a master simplicity, you will do just fine. If you
Huh.
listen to TV or motion pictures, you can play that. The music is not all that hard. You have to have a great sound. And that was just his whole thing, man. Like that's the Frank Sinatra thing. That's the long tones. Everything about him. It's not about playing like look at all this crazy low stuff. So it's about making music. And I think that's another reason why I compare him to Jaco Pastorius is because like I don't think Jaco was limited to I'm playing a bass. He was limited to I'm playing music. And I mean, obviously, these guys have a ton of differences, but that's just one of the things. And he would talk about, uh, even playing vibrato like the singers he would work with, just trying to emulate them with your hand and stuff, and not trying to get too crazy with it, like try and remain in that singer realm. um I looked into some other, just kind of trying to dig for deep things you may not know. He was into photography, and apparently he was a big fan of like black and white photography. And Irby Green got him into it. So I don't know, maybe Irby Green was into photography. That's an interesting little tidbit. But the last thing I want to do before we kind of move out of this section was this really fun little story I have here. He said, I probably shouldn't do this, but you see that plastic garbage bag? Watchers and I used to play a lot of dates, and we would sat next to each other. One night I saw a piece of paper on the floor, and I threw it under his chair. He would wait a couple of takes and then throw two pieces under my chair. This went on and on until there was a great little mound of garbage being thrown back and forth under our chairs. Well, the contractor is not very happy and says, "You guys are going to stay here until that mess is cleaned up." Not smart to do, but we've been doing that for years. Watchers, Marcellus and I are the best garbage players in the world. We don't do terrible things to each other. We really do. I I don't know. I just love that story, man, of like him calling himself the best garbage player in the world, and then them like him and Watchers. Like, I know that I've talked about this on here before, but like there's two kinds of people in the world, like trombone players and people who don't play trombone. And that just confirms, man, George Roberts was a trombone player at the end of the day. And I know it's kind of a weird one, but that's kind of what I want to use before we go into the break here. All right. Welcome back to the slideshow. All right, in the second half here, we're going to talk about recordings, and we're going to get into some gear stuff. But yeah, Ben, what you got for us on some George Roberts recordings?
So we were talking about just before the break, George Roberts spending time in LA. And on the LA scene, George Roberts did a lot of recording. He both as a sideman and as a leader. Now, as a leader, he only had 4 albums. I own 2 of those, and I was unable to find a way to listen to the other 2. The 2 that I actually own were the first 2 albums he did release, which were Meet Mr. Roberts and then Bottoms Up. I will say, I downloaded Bottoms Up and Meet Mr. Roberts as those were some of the first bass trombone, I guess, solo album I ever purchased. And I was sitting there looking. This was it's well-known information, but to me, it was news. I was just looking at the personnel, and I noticed that the music said written by John Williams. And I was sitting there thinking to myself, well, that's kind of funny. I wonder if he's related at all to the John Williams who does all those movie scores. Little did I know that most of the music written on those albums were arranged by John Williams, and he is also the piano player for George Roberts' group in that. So I thought that's pretty neat. Cody actually gave me as a gift one day the Meet Mr. Roberts album, the 1959 album, which I still have hanging.
Yeah, I found the vinyl. I couldn't remember if it was Meet Mr. Roberts or Bottoms Up that I found, but I can't even remember where I found that. But yeah, I found it and had to get it to you. Also, if you're for all the kids out there, if you think one of your friends may become one of the most famous composers of a generation and score a bunch of movies, have him be your piano player, and that obviously worked out so well.
Yeah, it did work out for George Roberts. Film scores. Most notably, like Jaws and King Kong, for example. George Roberts talked about how much fun he had on those sets. He said that was some of the most fun playing he had done, was sitting on the set of those film scores, working under John Williams. So that connection alone really got him. Got him a lot of work. And then of course, George Roberts did he recorded with Stan Kenton, which we've already talked a bit about that. And I was going to talk about some other people that he recorded with, with his connections to Nelson Riddle, Frank Sinatra, and that whole crew. He ended up recording with Sammy Davis Jr., Nat King Cole, Ella Fitzgerald. He recorded with the Four Freshmen. I mean, this man recorded with a lot of people. When we're talking about other trombone players, Tommy Peterson, all my friends are trombone players. That I actually went and listened to that album recently. It is definitely worth listening to. Favorite track on there, and probably is going to be the first track, which is Josephine. So I do suggest that one if you decide to listen to that. He also recorded with Jack Teagerton on an album, which is I didn't know that they had a connection. Sarah Vaughan. George Roberts is admittedly a big fan of Sarah Vaughan's voice and has talked about multiple times trying to make his trombone playing sound like her singing. So I thought that was interesting as well. So this man got to record with just about anybody you could imagine who was active during the time period. So he really put out a lot of material, and a lot of times it was behind the scenes. People didn't realize. We talked about movie soundtracks. Probably one that I guess kind of took me by surprise was he was the bass trombone player on the set of Enter the Dragon. I know Cody over here is a Bruce Lee fan, so
that was pretty cool. I did not know that.
I figured I'd mention that since you're such a Bruce Lee fan. Figured you'd want to know that George Roberts is on that.
Nice little Bruce Lee plug on the George Roberts pod.
But there's all sorts of other stuff too. Another really cool album that he did, that he was just a member on, was Pete Rugelow's 10 Trombones and 2 Pianos, or 10 Trombones Like 2 Pianos, which is pretty good. I don't know if we discussed this album before, but I highly suggest listening to that one as well.
Yeah, I think we've talked about a little bit. We've talked about on this pod, man. 10 Trombones Like 2 Pianos, though. Like, if that doesn't draw you in, I mean, I gotta check this out too, man. I don't think I've really listened to this that much, man. So it's like the trombonists represent fingers. Is that what we're looking at here? I guess, I'm just counting here on my hands that would be one piano, right? Why is it like 2 pianos? Shouldn't it be 20 trombones?
It's realistically, you're going, all it is, it's 12 trombones, or it's 8 or 10 trombones. 10 trombones and a rhythm section. So it's just it's that kind of setup that just your average trombone choir with a rhythm section at the time. They have I know they have a really good recording of Angel Eyes. I hadn't really heard. I can look at real quick at some of these songs, but I do have Angel Eyes in my library from this album.
Yeah, I guess the actual piano could be the other piano player. So
yeah. but anyways, yeah. So that is an album worth listening to as well. So I was just trying to go through some of the stuff that he's actually been on. Those aren't necessarily features, because he wasn't featured in every single thing that he played in. In fact, most of the time he's just the lonely bass trombone player. But he got a whole lot of work doing that, and he created a market for himself, which I think is what made George Roberts unique. And the fact that, like you said, when he realized, hey, I'm not going to be able to compete with Herbie, I'm going to do something totally different. I don't want to just say this off the top of my head, but I'm going to go out there and guess that George Roberts probably recorded way more than Herbie Green ever did.
Yeah, certainly in terms of raw recording, like in studios and stuff. I mean, not as like a leader, but yeah, like in just getting recorded.
Yeah. But that's the thing. That's the thing, though, is he realized what he would have to do to be marketable, and he did a good job of that. And we see that that exact same strategy play out again in other bass trombone players. Somebody who's unashamedly taking that approach would be like Bill Reichenbach. Bill Reichenbach, who has notably said that he has had a lot of influence by George Roberts. Maybe he took the more improvisatory approach. He's not necessarily a ballad player, but he does more improvisation. But he said, there's not a lot of bass trombones out here doing this, so I'm going to do that because I'm looking at the tenor trombone field and it seems crowded, so I'm going to do my own thing instead. And that's why he played bass trombone. So it's pretty neat to see that George Roberts' examples also followed by some of these guys too, and to see it. I mean, obviously it paid off for him since he recorded so much.
Yeah, I think George is a great role model in terms of working on the horn. In general, yeah, so much work, especially with also just being happy and like wanting to be at the gig and everything. He has a lot of great stuff on that. You should go check out if you want to dive a little deeper. He has a lot of good thoughts on working as a musician. Yeah, man. So talking about the gear that he used, um, I'm gonna go through the list of what he played and kind of go into the specs and stuff. But then there's like some overarching thoughts that kind of all of these horns feed into that he believed, and we'll kind of get into that. And before we do that, I want to say that like I found a lot of information on this trombone chat post where someone asked what his gear was. Um, and I'm not gonna lie, it kind of went south. It was a lot. At first there was a lot of good information, and then it turned into a lot of like fighting about how much does gear matter, which is an age-old debate. I mean, I guess I'll throw this disclaimer in there. I don't even feel like I need to say this, but obviously, if you want to sound like George Roberts, you should practice a lot. You should listen to him and practice, and like all of that is way more important than gear. And gear is not magic. It doesn't instantly make you sound like whoever. That being said, I also want to say that this is a podcast about trombones, and we're going to talk about gear. And I find researching gear to be really interesting and a fun topic. And man, I love the trombone, man. I love getting into the gear. And it's like, I know that if I had Aaron Judge's bat, it wouldn't make me hit home runs 400 feet or whatever, but it'd be cool to know what it was. That's kind of where I stand on it. Like, I'm not a hater. And certainly, gear can help. It's like it does make a difference. I'm not trying to like rile anyone up. I'm not saying it's the end of the world, it's the end all be all, but gear, like, it's using a tool that works well can help you not be so focused on the tool holding you up. And I think that's a big part of the gear conversation.
Well, I wasn't expecting a little sneak peek into the upcoming baseball podcast. No, I was just going to ask. So what trombones did you find that he played on? We'll start with just the horn, huh?
Yeah, so I didn't include this one actually, and I just thought about this. The first horn he ever played on was an old super. We know that because that story I looked up earlier about his first horn. That's not really important because it was the first tenor trombone his dad just bought him. I'm going to focus more on what he played on recordings and what he played professionally. The first one is a Con 70H, which is a 562 bore with a 9.5-inch bell with tuning in slide, which is something that I kind of pointed out to Ben that we didn't talk about on the slides episode. And neither of us have played tuning in slide, so I don't want to get too far into it. But that means that instead of having like his tuning slide in the bell, it was in the slide. Maybe you probably already knew that. If you didn't, there you go. That was like the first horn he played, and that's kind of important because all the horns that come after this one pretty similar to this one. Oh, I almost didn't note. We're gonna get into the details on each horn, but this one is a single trigger. All the horns he played were single trigger bass trombones. We'll get into that in a minute. The next horn that he played was, and there's a little debate on this, an Olds P22 George Roberts model, which is a single trigger 565 bore with a 9-inch bell, not 9.5, and normal tuning. Now, I should say that's also single trigger. I should say that some people said I had some trouble researching this. Some people said that he played an old S22, not a P22 during this period. And the S22 had tuning and slide. I had a really hard time finding information on this S22. It's possible that it doesn't even exist. I don't want to say it doesn't exist. It probably exists. I had a lot of trouble with it. If you know anything about this, like please hit me up. I'd imagine it's the same as the P22, just with tuning and bell. And it's possible, or I'm sorry, tuning and slide. It's possible that he played like a specialized P22 that had the tuning and slide, but more or less he made a big switch to olds. And we'll talk about that horn in a second too. Then there's a little bit of argument on the order after this, but he played for some period of time a Holton 183, which is 562 9-inch bell with a single trigger once again. And then after that, he played a Constable, George Roberts model, 9.5-inch bell, kind of going back to that 70H. I thought this was a 593 bore. Now that could just be the modern ones, but when I looked up the Constable George Roberts model, that was the number that kept coming up. I find this a little weird because this is like a lot bigger than the other ones he played. Now, maybe it's possible that he had something different and they just marketed the George Roberts like this. Maybe he just went up. I don't know. We'll talk about that. It has a normal tuning on it, but it's not tuning inside. It's a normal in the bell, but it's got like a really weird looking mechanism on it. You should go check it out. This horn was super interesting looking to me.
Well, that's part of the reason it has a weird looking mechanism on it. You might be looking at the horn with the drop-in valve that he did not really use. So where you might see that weird mechanism that you're looking at, Cody, there would just be a regular bow for the tuning slide. So you're probably looking at the horn with the drop-in second trigger if you're looking at the Constable 1670. So that's probably what's throwing you off, is looking at it with the drop-in slide or the drop-in valve.
Yeah, man, maybe I don't I don't know, man.
Yeah. He didn't use the second valve, and so the 1670 had this weird. I guess we don't need. We'll get into detail about it later, but it's just got a really long, like 2-foot long link from the trigger to the valve.
And then after that, he switched to, and the timing on when he played these is a little debated. He played a Con 110H, but per Massimo Perrone, it wasn't really a 110H. It was like a specialized horn that was like he said like a Con 98. The 110H has a 562 bore with the 10-inch bell, 594 through the rotor sections. I will say that Massimo had a couple things to say about it, and Massimo did talk to him about his gear. So no matter what, like, I guess it could be incorrect, but I tend to want to lean towards what Massimo's saying since they talked about it. And Massimo kind of noted that most of his horns were somewhat customized. And one of the big ways that this was apparently he used a Burt Herrick made lead pipe. Now later, through most of his career, he played a Bach 1.5 of his mouthpiece, and eventually he switched to a custom-made Burke Herrick mouthpiece, which was very similar to the Bach, but it was a little oversized. And even later, there was a Constable mouthpiece. I don't know how much he actually played on it, but it was basically a copy of that Burke Herrick mouthpiece. I kind of had trouble finding a ton of stuff on Burke Herrick as far as just him as a person, but he was a pretty famous mouthpiece builder. As a lot of like custom trumpet mouthpieces Definitely kind of left an impact in that matter. But he had a relationship with George, and I guess that kind of was a big factor in his gear. But like all of his horns are in some way a copy of that 70H going down. Now, a couple things to note with all of these horns, they're all single triggers. And George talked about the single trigger thing a lot. And I think there was two aspects to this. One, he talked about, especially as an older guy, like not wanting to switch, but also feeling it as a lot lighter. You know, he noted that when he would play a heavier horn, he'd have to put it down and shake out his hand. And I had kind of heard this before, like he didn't want all that weight. And I think that probably affected him in terms of like musical, like thought and everything. He didn't want to be focusing on how heavy his horn was. But I also heard some stuff, also found some stuff while digging through this that I didn't really know, which is I think he kind of thought that single triggers were easier to play. Also, I'll say before we get into this that if any of this is like contrary to what you believe or whatever, I think that, you know, I mean, personally, these aren't my thoughts. These are George's thoughts. I definitely don't have thoughts on what bass trombone you should be playing. That's not, as a tenor trombonist, it's not my bag. But also, I think even George would be okay with whatever you're playing. He did note that he felt like what the horn that was right for him wasn't necessarily the horn right for you that fit different people. Um, but he pointed out that the single trigger was like a little bit easier to play and stuff, and that he really didn't feel like he needed the double trigger that often, and that if he was going to hit like a low E, he would just pull his valve way out till it was an F or an E trigger instead of a F trigger. I'm sorry, low B. Sorry, he would just pull it out till it was an E trigger instead of an F trigger, and he had kind of mentioned like how he felt like it was easier to play, like it just sounded better because it resonated better because it wasn't as heavy. And had even talked about how some like orchestra guys, I'm not going to get into the details of who, had come to him and said, like, oh, like, how did you do all these recordings on the single trigger? And he was like, it's like the way to go, like it's just easier and smoother. Like, how often are you basically dropping these bombs, like let's kind of make big low notes and stuff. um and that some of these guys had like the same people who had talked to him about this were playing these big horns, and then later he come back and they were playing like a box single trigger. Um so I think that his belief in the single trigger kind of extends past just his comfort level, but also him feeling like the resonation of the horn was actually, or is that a word? Resonation? The horn resonated better. Which I don't personally have any thoughts on, but something to keep in mind. And I know when we talked about bass trombone triggers, that was a big episode for us. Um, I had talked about looking into it, and we had discussed kind of the thoughts back and forth on single versus double for you in deciding. Those are just George's thoughts. Now, you know, if you're a bass trombonist and you got a lot of money, you know, why not both? I'm a big I'm a big fan of that. See what works out for you. But if you're making the decision for yourself, I'm not saying you should necessarily model after George. I'm just saying that those are George's thoughts on the single trigger. Um, so with just we'll start off with the Con 70H. He noted that one of the reasons he played this horn was that whenever he got around to the con, he didn't feel like there was a lot of viable pro bass trombones out there. He felt like it was basically Kahn and Bach that was making like a solid professional model bass trombone. And I actually found this pretty cool note where he said he was talking about tuning and slide and a slide weight, and he said, I'm not Tommy Dorsey, so I don't need a feather light slide. I found that sometimes the weight actually helped me, which is crazy. I didn't know that that was like kind of a belief of his. And we just did the slides episode, so it was cool to pick that up. I also love the line, I'm not Tommy Dorsey, so I don't need a feather light slide. Um, that's it. I read into that however you will. Um, the next one he played after that was the Olds P22, and it's the Olds P22 George Roberts model. I just talked about how there's possibly the S22. That would have been George Roberts model as well. He said with this horn, he didn't want it called George Roberts model. Like he kind of went out of his way to say like it wasn't a matter of arrogance or like having his name on a horn. That wasn't a big deal to him. Apparently, like Olds wanted it to say that because they were kind of transitioning from just having student line horns to having pro model horns, and they wanted a professional player's name on the horn. Um, and I found some people who like said that this he was still playing a Bach mouthpiece when he moved to this horn. And there's some debate on the exact time that he switched to this horn. Some people said mid 60s. One source said it was 1974. Hard date. They claim to note as a fact. I'm not saying anyone's right or wrong. I just don't know for sure. I'm just trying to get out everything. A couple people said it was 1978, and this is also the year that Olds went out of business. So that could be one of the reasons why this horn was like had a gold bell with nickel silver on the slide, which are and most of the tubing as well. And it seems like he kind of uh preferred like this darker gold and like a nickel slide most of the time. Um they also, when they made this horn, he used a copy of the Remington lead pipe that was already out there. And one of the guys who helped make this horn for him, and this is obviously important later, was the product foreman or production manager, I think is his official title, who at the time happened to be Zig Constel, which it's probably is how he ended up playing a Constel later. I guess he had a relationship with them, and I think he helped him a lot with the lead pipe situation as well. The Holton 183, I didn't have a ton of information on him. I just found a couple people saying that this was kind of like a stopgap horn between the olds and what it's console time. There's also a bunch of horns that he supposedly played on later in life and stuff. Um, the ones I'm talking about are like the big ones that were associated with him and that you can kind of find out there. I've heard that like as he got older, like he had a bunch at his house that he liked messing around with. I think like when we're identifying horns that like are his sound or whatever, these are the horns that have that title. So maybe don't look too much into the Holton, although interesting to look at it and realize that it has basically the same specs as the other ones we're looking at. Now, the Constel model uh, was a product of him. I have like a neat little story on this. He went to the Constel factory just to see Zig because he was a friend of his. It had nothing to do with picking up a horn. And he was going through and he said that when Zig saw him, he said, come over here, come check this out. And he like picked from a bunch of bells and he picked a slide and he put it together. And he said, check this out. And he said he played it. And George said, I need another horn, like I need a hole in the head. But he ended up going in with him and making the bass trombone. It seems to kind of fit the normal specs. Like I said, 593, I'm not sure about. There's also a good chance that the current console model is not the exact one that George had. And that's kind of the case for any of these horns, although there was a lot of debate about this online and whether or not he used the straight up horn that was made for him or whether or not these horns were like custom made for him and then people played other stuff. And then the same thing with the 110H. I wouldn't really know about this horn except for there's a pretty cool video of him playing in a studio, and there was a big conversation about what horn he was playing in that video. I think the real takeaway is go check out this video because it's super cool him playing in the studio and getting to see him play and everything. And then even you can listen to the recording after it's been mixed and everything. But there was a conversation about the horn, and this was one of the ones that like was really debated. And also where I found a bunch of stuff where Massimo was saying that all of his horns were custom, and also that lead pipe we were just talking about, that Burke Herrick lead pipe, was on all of his horns or something identical to that lead pipe. So I think big takeaways are just like the single trigger thing. We're looking at like he didn't want to get too big on the bore size, like 562. Although that console kind of contradicts that, but I don't know. We can talk about that. He went to about a 9.5 inch bell, nine sometimes, and he just liked gold brass. There's one thing I wasn't sure if I wanted to get into this or not, but some people online claim that he almost had a collaboration with Yamaha, and they like worked together to build a horn. And supposedly, this isn't fact, but this is, I guess this is me stirring up drama or whatever. But supposedly they sent him a horn, and then they sent him a bill, and George was like offended, and he was like, "No, I'm not doing this." And then the collab went south, and it never was actually made. Now, I don't know that for a fact, but that is a fun story. I do like the idea of Yamaha sending him this horn and him being like, and them sending him a bill and him being like, "No, dude, like, do you know who I am? Like, you gotta be kidding me." Um, and for
I
all the
don't want to believe that.
for all the Yamaha people out there, he did mention when he was talking about different horns, he did mention Doug Yo, and he mentioned that like Doug Yo played a great sound and everything, and played a Yamaha, and was talking about how there was so many people making great bass trombones, and clearly was saying that Yamaha made a great bass trombone. So I don't think he hated Yamaha or anything, but possibly there was like a south relationship there between the two of them. And I'll also say that one of my last thoughts on Gear was he was like a big person to talk about how if the horn was too big and too heavy, and this kind of ties into single double trigger thing, the sound would go, and I'm kind of quoting him here, sideways as opposed to straight forward. And this was a big thing with Irby Green, and just like playing melodies and projecting out as opposed to being too dark and going out and losing the characteristics of a trombone. Now, that's definitely, he said that a lot, and that's definitely like a George thought. I don't know if I agree with that. And like, just as somebody who listens to a lot of bass trombone, I've probably never thought, man, that's too dark for me. Like, I'm personally kind of a fan, especially like, for example, we talked about like earlier, Ben Van Dyke has an incredible dark sound to me. But that was definitely one of his thought processes behind the horns he played, was this idea of projecting forward as opposed to expanding outward.
That is something that comes up in the bass trombone world quite a bit. I have definitely heard that said, not just by George Roberts, but I think even Irby Green probably leaned that way when he said, "You play that thing like a trombone." Uh, the bass trombone world's kind of been like an arms race, I guess is the best way to say it. We keep getting bigger and bigger instruments. We go from 547 bore, that used to be a bass trombone. Then we go up to 562, and then we go up to 562 to 578 dual bore. And yeah, I could see why George was saying that it's getting a little bit too big and too dark, because to a point they start to sound like a slide tuba almost. So I just coming from my side of it is something that I was even told multiple times, in my lessons, both over at Monticello and over at Northwestern State. I was often reminded, hey, just so you know, try to brighten up your sound a little bit, because bass trombone is naturally dark anyways, so you don't want to swallow the sound.
Yeah, man. Also, his mouthpiece, I won't go too crazy into this, was basically, they kept saying oversized Bach 1.5. Bach 1.5s have a 27 millimeter diameter rim. They have a deep cup and a 429 back bore with a 0.276 throat. Um, I had a real hard time finding Burt Herrick's exact specs. The Constal mouthpiece, which supposedly is a copy of the Burt Herrick mouthpiece, is 27 millimeter diameter, a deep cup, with a 302 throat, I suppose at 276. I don't know what the backbore is, but I assume the larger throat makes the backbore bigger. So essentially, it was just a Bach 1.5 that was a little more blown out on the back end. Um, so I don't know. I think I've been kind of in the past. I've been in the camp of not being too heavy on the mouthpiece that whoever you listen to plays. Like, as a personal opinion, because I kind of said this with the Curtis Fuller episode, and then we did mouthpieces. I'm definitely more of a mouthpiece that fits you as opposed to mouthpiece that your hero plays. But if you want to know, that's where it's at. Um, and I think on that note, I think I'm gonna I don't know why we're doing it with mouthpieces, but that's kind of where I'm going to wrap this up. Uh, I want to go quickly and just before we get into the album rec, I want to say like I was already a big fan of George Roberts, but doing all this research on him, and I hopefully I gave you something you didn't know, like a fun nugget or two. His life was massive, and I didn't cover everything. I didn't even get close, and there's like so much great stuff out there. I like really encourage you to go explore yourself and see what you can find interviews with him talking. I think my big takeaways were just like he was an incredibly kind person who was always grateful for the moment he was in, and I think that's kind of the takeaway I want to get. I could I could take away all this stuff about gear, or I could take away a number of things, but like as a guy who tries to get gigs and like tries to be a working musician, his devotion to being a positive person and a positive force in the world, and feeling like that was reflected back on both his playing and his amount of work he got, I think is my biggest takeaway from this. And I'm maybe even a bigger George fan than I was before after doing this pod.
Yeah, man. George, like as we've done more research on him this week, I realized the biggest thing that I came to realize was just that it's so much bigger than just he was the first guy to really do solo bass trombone and do it well. I realized it was so much bigger than that. I guess I had no clue that he was just influential in the musical world in general, and I didn't realize that. I mean, he was helping craft or helping mold a lot of the modern setups we see today in like big band and things like that, and just orchestration. I mean, parts were being written for this guy, and because those parts were written for this guy, nowadays we have like our normal, I guess what we consider our normal setup, or just kind of the way things are now because of this one dude. So it's really cool to see how the world kind of changed with him. And I was just sitting here just reading some interviews with different bass trombonists, and just every single one that I'm reading, every interview I find that I'm reading, George Roberts is mentioned on there, and that's got to be pretty powerful. I don't think if I were to do the same thing with tenor trombonists that they could agree on one person. You'll see the same names pop up a little bit, but I don't think anything to this extent.
Yeah, man. I mean, that's what he is, Mr. Bass Trombone. I mean, that's he's the man. Um, the album recommendation for this week is a George album, of course. Normally we would do like the personnel stuff, but this one's a little different. It's the Nelson Riddle album that we talked about earlier, The Joy of Living. And this was recorded in 1959, and there was a reissue in 1998, which may be part of the reason that this album sounds so crispy clean. But this is one of my personal favorite George albums. It's not actually like it's not George Roberts, The Joy of Living. It's Nelson Riddle, but George has like 4 or 5 songs on the album where it's just him playing the melody, and it really speaks to like a couple things. It speaks to like his all of his things he talks about in terms of singing and long tones and melody on the horn. It also talks about his relationship with Nelson, and it also talks about his devotion to making the bass trombone, as he put it, the greatest melody horn in the world. And man, like man, if you go, please go listen to the album. Him playing "Making Whoopee" on that album, man, is just like it's just such a vibe. It sounds so buttery and so delicious, man. Like, if you haven't heard it, like I highly recommend you go check it out. It's just he sounds incredible on that album. All right, well, on that note, I think we're gonna cut an episode. Probably gonna go over an hour this time, but I'm not too worried about it. Let me know if you're feeling like these are going too long. Sure, hit me up. If you're like, man, like I don't care, I want to know that too. But as always, thanks for listening and happy shedding.